This is Tim.
I'm Mulele.
And this is Critiquing Comics. Welcome to Critiquing Comics. This is Tim with Mulele in Tokyo, and as you know, we have a friend down in Nagoya, Adam Passion. I talked to him when I stopped through Nagoya, talked to him for the podcast back in March, April, and he runs Big Ugly Robot Press, and he sent us a couple comics that just came out from Big Ugly Robot. So the first one we're going to talk about is Chikamatsu Monzaemon's The Love Suicides at Sonezaki, adapted by Chieko Kobayashi. So this is originally a Bunraku puppet play that actually I looked up some information on Wikipedia here too. There is some information in the back of this book, which is, by the way, set up to read right to left like manga, and it's bilingual, both languages, Japanese and English in it. But this story was first performed as Bunraku in 1703. Now, kind of interesting thing about this book, the characters are drawn as Bunraku puppets.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know if our listeners are familiar with Bunraku. These are very elaborate puppets, which generally, at least for the main characters, it takes 3 people to control one puppet. I saw Bunraku myself once a long time ago. It's something that I've been meaning to do again all the time I've been in Japan, and I never seem to get around to it. I've been to Kabuki, but haven't made it to Bunraku again. But yeah, so these are not your hand puppets. This is something more elaborate. But I wasn't sure how I felt about making the characters puppets. I mean, their surroundings don't look like a Bunraku stage. They look like a normal human environment, but just the characters are puppets. Which means, it's the same thing you've got in Bunraku, which means that the facial expressions never change. As in Bunraku, you don't have that dimension, and I wasn't sure if I necessarily liked that. I mean, when you watch the Bunraku play, at least you've got music and sound to kind of guide your reaction, where you don't have that in this, and I thought maybe it didn't quite work as well. I don't know, how did you feel about that choice?
Well, it was a little bit hard to get into it at the beginning, and I think it's not the fault necessarily of the work itself, but more of a misunderstanding of what it is when you start to read it. There's an explanation about Bunraku and some of the other things that happen in the book on the last page, but not reading that first. Mm-hmm. You just dive in, and there's an adjustment period. It took me till about page 10 to kind of adjust myself to what the comic was trying to do. And it seems to me that this is not just the puppets, and is also not just a straight narrative. It takes swatches of kimono patterns of the time, bits of paintings, bits of hand-drawn. There's like hand-drawn, looks more typeset. But anyway, it takes little bits and pieces from the culture of the time and presents them in kind of a patchwork fashion, which gives more of a feeling of it rather than direct representation in the panels. And so I guess my feeling is more of a culmination of what I've seen in the book rather than the book telling me explicitly this is what it is. So there is kind of a need to check your expectations on the first page. But I think the book would be served better by having that explanation at least a little bit more towards the front.
Yeah.
That it would teach you that in some sort of teach you what it needs to have you understand that it is different from conventional comics or manga.
Mm-hmm.
That it stylistically it pushes in another direction, because it does do that, and it actually does what it sets out to do well. But for the uninitiated, it's a little bit jarring, and I think that was the kind of. I had the same feeling that you had, like I don't know about this, but by the end of the story, it had dissipated, and with the explanation at the end, I felt satisfied.
Mm-hmm. I read after I read the comic, I read the plot summary on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And I noticed that there were a couple of things in there that I thought the comic didn't communicate very well.
What's that?
So let's see, I'm going to stumble over character names here. So the lovers in the story are, let's see, the guy is Tokubei and the woman is Ohatsu. And so there's a scene where Tokubei gets beat up, but it's a little hard to get that from the comic. So on page 15, so this guy that he loaned money to and is now acting like I never borrowed money from you. Then he gets all indignant and you're trying to besmirch my name and I'm going to beat you up. But we don't see him actually getting beat up, and then on the next page, we get people talking like that he was arrested for swindling. Somebody else said, I heard he was beaten to death. But we don't see any evidence that he got beat up. When we see him again, well, I actually kind of missed him. This was the next thing. He's wandering the street with this big straw hat that covers his face. And if you're vigilant, you notice that it's the same striped kimono.
Yeah.
But there's no indication that he's been beaten up, really. Not clearly. But then he sort of sneaks into the scene there, and then the other thing that I didn't get from this was that he is hiding in her robes. There's a scene where we see kind of her like waist level, and she says, hide in here. But I didn't get from that she meant here in my robes. I thought she was indicating somewhere else. And then we see, there's a panel that's just her and some other women, and then a panel where it's, I guess, this is reading right to left. We can see like his shoulder and back and the back of his head as he's on the floor next to her. But I didn't understand where he was really. And then like a couple panels later, he's sort of peeking out from somewhere, and I guess I'm seeing now that it's probably the same pattern as her kimono, so it's within her kimono. And then the clearest indication, although I was still kind of lost, I thought he was under the table or something, where he's got her foot by his neck. Now, that scene is explained in an end note, but where it says that he is pulling her foot across his neck to indicate he's willing to die. But there's no indication of movement in that panel, so you don't really get that meaning from it. You can't tell that the foot is being moved. So all those things, I just felt like the storytelling wasn't quite there. I wasn't getting those pieces.
I have to admit, it is a little bit disjointed in that sense. But I think to my mind, the artist is capable of telling the story that way if she chose to. But she, I think, tried to split the difference with the Bunraku puppetry, and that shifted everything. There is something a little bit Lynchian about it. Maybe because I was watching Twin Peaks earlier today, but I wasn't so bewildered by the movement of the characters. Some of the designs I questioned a little bit, but understanding that they are puppets later is what kind of solidifies it for me. But there is kind of a lot of after the fact, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
So I think that's the one point where I wish there was some sort of primer for the book rather than a straight dive in.
Right, because a lot of the readers probably have even less knowledge of Bunraku than I do, and it's if you're expecting sort of a regular comic, yeah, you're going to be lost, possibly.
Yeah. I would say it bears reading twice just to kind of understand it, but the story itself reminds me of the I guess drama, you could call it, going on with Ebizo and his wife. Ebizo is a kabuki actor whose wife recently died of breast cancer, I think. It's kind of a tragic story, being that she's so young. She's in her 30s, and they apparently loved each other quite deeply. So much so that Japan, as a society, seems to be kind of wrapped by what has happened here, and it unfolded over, I think, a year or two. But I'm just hearing about it this week, and kind of like, oh. And then I read this, and I think, it's a similar kind of true love with tragic end story. Although there was no suicide involved in the Ebizo story, but I can kind of see where there's a lot of power in the story itself if you let go of the idea that you have to be convinced that these two people love each other. There's no build up to this. It's like, okay, here are these two characters, they love each other, and then here's the situation, and here's what they've decided to do, and then they did it. And it says on the face of it, the love suicides at Sonezaki. So there's no question here.
That gives away the ending.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it is something very removed from the average comic. I don't think it's bad at all, but I think it does go in directions that are unexpected, and in some ways are unreconcilable. Is that a word? Irreconcilable? Yeah. Is that a better word? Unfathomable, I guess. Until it's explained explicitly on the last page, where they have notes about the story. So yeah, I don't think it's bad at all, but I think it is a bit of a hard read.
And yeah, the art is interesting because a lot of it there's not much gray; it's just black and white. which really makes it pop in a lot of places. And, the striped kimonos and everything. And so that aspect I particularly like, I think. And it makes it feel kind of that time of, early 18th century Japan.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Anything else about that?
No, but well, yes, actually. Just art-wise, not understanding the puppets at the beginning did throw me a little bit, but the sense of design and attention to detail in especially the kimono and just the overall design sense, especially of the cover, that's some gorgeous work. Really, really beautiful work. Yeah, I quite liked looking at it, although reading it was a bit of a puzzle.
All right, and we have one more, and who knows how long we're going to talk about this, because it is related to our own experiences, or has a lot in common with them. So this is I Am an A.L.T, as told by Ian M., who has been on the podcast before. And A.L.T stands for Assistant Language Teacher. And as he explains in the book, there are, many assistant language teachers in Japan teaching elementary or junior high or high school, and generally they are the employees of dispatch companies, which then the school, or they hire the company to send them a certain number of teachers, and it's a nice arrangement for the school and, of course, for the dispatch company, but generally not so much for the teacher. And, of course, these are generally Americans, Canadians, British, sometimes people even from non-English-speaking countries. My 15-year-old daughter's been complaining about her A.L.Ts who were from, where did she say, Pakistan or someplace? And she complains their English is much different from mine.
That's curious, because I thought to get a visa you needed to have you needed to be from a country that had English as its official language.
Well, I mean, I know that the dispatch company I used to work for had teachers who were not from native English-speaking countries. I don't know the visa details of that, but yeah, they exist. Anyway, so Ian explains here how he had been teaching in English conversation schools where the students are adults, and then how he ended up moving to being an assistant language teacher, and then the screwed up contract situation that he was in, and how the extent to which it had been resolved at the time he finished the book. And of course, just a few episodes ago, episode 113 of Critiquing Comics, you were talking about your own English conversation school situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's. I mean, I think I've been relatively lucky in my situations, but yeah, the teachers are often have to deal with this kind of crap.
Well, let me kind of preface our conversation about this by saying that it wasn't always this way. About 26 years ago, when I first got here, this is, of course, during the bubble economy. I came here in '91, and English teachers were not so plentiful, and there was no internet, so there was no 500 yen or $5 English lessons from the Philippines. Um, but by the way, I should mention that this comic that we are reading is also $5. Um, yeah. Um, but anyway, the idea of a teacher getting 10,000 yen, or at the time the equivalent of about $90 um, for one hour lesson was not unheard of, and in fact, the average was about $50. So it was quite good back in the day, and so you'd pop over to Japan, make a shit fuck ton of money, scuttle back to your own country and buy a house after a couple of years' work. And I know some people who did that. They got out right around the time that the English teaching industry crashed and burned, right after the bubble economy burst.
Yeah, like 1991, 92-ish.
Yeah, I mean, I got here just at the tail end. Hey, that looks like something I can do for a little bit of cash while I study, and then the bottom fell out. Mm-hmm. So since then, it's kind of gone through various changes. Sometimes I felt that the industry is a little bit bulletproof in that but of course I was just looking at the number of lessons I was teaching, not the actual per lesson pay rate. But the number of lessons would increase the worse the economy got, up until 2008, where the economy crashed so hard that people weren't trying to get an edge over their competitors with English. They were trying to survive. Mm-hmm. If they could. English then became a secondary thing, and that began to fade. But when I think back to how much I was making in 2003, I was making about 2,000 yen an hour. And then fast forward to last year, 2016, I was making 2,000 yen an hour. So for the past 25 years, it's been the same price at these schools. Mm-hmm. No cost of living allowance, no raise for inflation. And I should also say that this is considered illegal. But most English school companies operate in a gray zone that's getting darker and darker as the years progress. And so that kind of brings us up to where Ian's story begins.
So what is illegal? To not give pay increases?
If you are a contract worker, let's say you and forgive me if I get some of the details wrong. It's been a while since I've gone through this, but if you had a full-time contract, you were a full-time employee, you were automatically given a pay rise every year. It was the law if your company followed the law. But a lot of companies kind of skirted that because the attitude of the labor standards office, the LSO, was that if there is no complaint, there's no problem. They do no policing of any sort. And if there is a complaint, you have to prove to them that the complaint is worthy of their attention. So my boss didn't pay me often doesn't cut it. Or my boss didn't pay me what they promised doesn't cut it. In America, you can sue when this happens, and the loser of the case will often have to pay for the lawyer of the winner. But in Japan, that doesn't work. That doesn't happen. There's no compensation for that, and judges often like to mediate for the people to settle out of court. And they're very heavy-handed in that. And having just gone through that a couple months ago, and seeing the process like unfold in front of my face, it's very dicey. You will more likely than not lose money in the deal, and the judges favor the companies because they feel that the individual will bend more quickly than the company will. So, if you are a what do they call it? A worker who is a contract worker. I think it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm brain farting all over the place, but
I'm glad I can't smell it from here.
Yeah, it's pretty rough here. If you are a independent contractor, thank you. If you're an independent contractor, the rules of the game say that they don't have to treat you like a regular employee, which means they don't offer you any severance. They don't have to tell you too far in advance that you are being let go. When the contract is up, they can just say, no new contract, goodbye, and that's it. But the other side of that, I should say, all of the eikaiwas and English schools are going this way currently. I think Nova and GABA and maybe even Berlitz announced that they were going to go that way. But the thing of it is illegal for them to then tell you that you have to show up at a certain place and teach from a certain textbook and to dress a certain way. That is something that they cannot control.
Huh.
And I sued my former employer based on this. Now, I heard reports back from friends I have still in the company that the managers were walking around after they heard that they had lost this case. Well, how can we control what's going on if we can't tell them where to teach, how to teach, and what to wear? But that's exactly it. If you want to have that independent contractor, I can have the student come to my house. I can have the student go to a cafe instead of just sitting in their office and teach there. There should be nothing that they can do about it. I also don't have to wear a necktie. I can come in a t-shirt and jeans, short, whatever I want. I can teach naked. And really, as long as the customer, the student themselves, does not have a problem with it, there is nothing legally that they can do to stop it, and they should not be able to fire me for it. And so, because they kind of ignore that, but then try to apply we're only going to pay you and use your contract according to the rules of these rules over here that we want to pay attention to. That's where it gets very gray.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have to force their hand, and I think that's what Ian was going through. He was caught in between, it sounds like, several different factions, all trying to kind of get either their own way or support each other in some way, and basically not move the needle too much.
Yeah, so he's working for the dispatch company as an ALT, and then that company loses their contract with the public school system. And so he applies to the new company, which is, he said, it's run by the most hated English conversation company, or eikaiwa, in Japan. And so this company, like from the beginning, he points to things that should have been red flags for him, and he kind of glossed over them at the time. But they didn't really seem to know what they were doing. And then at the last minute, suddenly the Board of Education canceled the contract. And it's hard to say who to blame there, if it was the contractor or the Board of Education. But then, I don't know, it's hard to explain it from there. It's kind of... it's kind of confusing. And then he works with the union, and they're not really worth anything either.
Well, I've heard that about the union, that they aren't very they aren't very much anything. And actually watching them try to hold a press conference or do some sort of action to protect the teachers when Nova went belly up, and that was fucking ugly. But they were as flaccid as ever when it came to that situation. So I wouldn't expect them to be able to help Ian. I wouldn't expect them to help me. So I never approached them. I never went to them. I never dealt with them. I never became a member. And seeing that teaching wages in Japan have gone down consistently over the past 30 years, what are they? I don't know. They're not the I was. And paying dues supports them, but it doesn't support me. So maybe I'm thinking of it wrong. Maybe Ian's doing it wrong. I don't know. But it seems like he tried, but wasn't getting support.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. I should mention that this is going to be less of a review and more of a rant. Because
if you haven't figured it out by now.
The subject is so frustrating for so many people who've gone through the system. I don't know about A.L.Ts, but I know about A.K.I.L.S, and fuck me, I'm never going to work for one of those again. I'd rather fucking starve in the streets of Tokyo. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got off okay with my part-time gig with the dispatch company I was in, but there were plenty of kind of frustrating aspects to it. Yeah, I mean, not the least of which was that the company and the school I was at had different ideas about what I was supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I tended to default to what the school wanted, since, the school was who you see every day.
Yeah.
And, the guy, like maybe once a year, somebody from the dispatch company comes to watch class and gives you some advice, and then you never see him again.
It gives you advice on a thing that he doesn't know anything about.
Right.
To a teacher who's most likely more experienced in teaching than he is.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck that.
Yeah, I didn't really apply stuff that he told me. It was like, well, yeah, but I know that's not going to work, so whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think which is much better. There's no point in really calling it out. Just like, okay, and see you next year. Much, much better. But, I mean, sometimes I get so frustrated with this shit, I just want to call them out on all of the nonsense and just say, well, look, do you think that's going to work in the classroom? Why don't you give me a demonstration right now? Because I'm having trouble understanding it. And watch them bulk. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. So, but, sorry, man. Let's focus a little bit more on the comic.
Comic? What comic? Oh, this one. Yeah, well, we should mention the cover. It's very much patterned on like early 50s EC horror comics, which I thought was a really nice touch, with the way that the top part of the cover is this big red box, and then the way that the title is written in it with the kind of wavy letters A.L.T, and the three kind of little circles down the side with, featuring. He's got old bean counters, corporate cogs, and the children. And the title, In the Grip of Bureaucracy. So, yeah, I really like the cover.
Yeah, I like it too, especially Ian's facial expression with him tearing his hair out and the city twisting behind him. That was brilliant. I quite like it.
Yes. I'd like a poster of this cover.
Yeah.
Now, the cover's full color. The interior is black and white and pink, which I thought was an interesting choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I have to admit, some of the lettering is a little bit thin, and so when he does white on pink lettering, it's a little bit hard to read in some places. Not a lot, but just sometimes a little bit. Maybe it's just that my eyes don't register pink as well as I'd like them to.
Yeah, well, it's not quite enough contrast So that made it a little hard to read for me. If the pink were a little darker, it would be better. I mean, it's okay. I've seen worse, but it does make it a little tough to read.
Maybe we're just getting old.
Well, that could be too. But I mean, that's a minority of the panels. There's more black lettering on white background than white lettering on pink background. So that's not a major problem. But it does happen a couple times on most pages.
Yeah.
I was interested in the way that he did the last scene where he's like, giving us the explanation of what happened and sort of the maybe not quite resolution of the situation, but at least kind of updating us. And he's moving through town, and we get a lot of shots of him. He's talking, he's explaining it to us. It's not narration boxes mostly, but we don't see his face in most of those panels, and a lot of them he's pretty far from us. And in one he's like gotten on a train, and the train, it's like subway, and it's disappeared into the tunnel, and he's talking to us word balloons coming out of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And there's another where he's way down at the bottom of an escalator, and we're at the top looking down at him, this little tiny figure in the middle of the panel. But yeah, he's moving towards this place where he is at the end, where he sits down by a flower box in the street and just like draws the cityscape that he sees. So yeah, that was like visually interesting, having him like move through town there.
Yeah. To be honest, as frustrating as it was for me to read it, and I should say not at all because of the artwork or the color scheme or, but just having the experience of what he's going through. It was really, really nice to see at the end, that last page. For me, that made a really satisfying conclusion to this book, although not quite a conclusion to the story. He seemed to find a little bit of balance with where he was at.
Yeah, he says, on October 1st, I sat on a street corner and drew a picture, leisurely, and felt lighter than I had in months. I'll continue to do what I can do. Yeah.
It was just satisfying to kind of come to that conclusion after all this fucking shit.
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, if there's anyone out there who's in another country thinking of coming to Japan to teach, if you're not going to teach at a university, don't bother. The bottom's fell out years ago, has not recovered, and people are trying to kind of find balance here. But all in all, I'd say no. And in fact, I was talking to a recruiter the other day, kind of looking over my career, and said, yeah, you were in Eikaiwa for a long time, and actually a lot of Eikaiwa teachers, English teachers, come to us and ask about getting out of English teaching, and the first question is, well, what's your experience? And if all you have is English teaching, then they can't help you. 2 years is the limit. 5 years, you're a lifer in the system, and you kind of want to stay away from that. And they actually looked at my resume and said that I was pretty lucky to have had some work in another industry, and which is giving me options now. So yeah, if you're listening to this saying, maybe it'd be fun to join Tim and Mulele in Tokyo, no.
Yeah, well, yeah. Man, well, I never worked for a big Eikaiwa school. I was working for a small one on, out in the suburbs that was run by a very honest guy, and never got a pay raise, unfortunately, but the business was kind of struggling in the latter years and finally closed after I'd worked there for, 21 years.
Yeah.
And since then, I've been teaching privately on Skype and in coffee shops. And then the assistant language teacher thing. Right now, I feel very fortunate that I'm doing. It's a part-time gig working directly for the school, and I get, rather than getting paid by the class, I'm getting paid the same 12 months a year. So it's, obviously I'm doing other things besides that. I'm, as Ian says in the book, he's diversified his income sources. I mean, he's been doing having private students the whole time too.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's the way for a foreigner to survive here, unless you've got a full-time job in a different industry. To just have multiple sources of income, so that if the bottom falls out of one, you're not down to suddenly 0 yen per month.
Yeah, I would say if you are thinking about it, read this comic first and then think again. Think carefully. If you're here for a specific reason, like you wanted to get in touch with some part of Japanese culture, or you've realized that your life in your own country is so fucking bad, this looks like a step up. Yeah. read this book and then decide whether or not you want to get into it. At least as far as English teaching goes. If you've got other skills, do that. That's fine. That's maybe a different problem. But I think that some of the problems that Ian faces here are kind of indicative of a lot of non-full-time work problems in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And in English teaching, there are no full-time jobs that I see. Very, very rare and lucky few that get some sort of tenured professor position at a university. Most of the university work even is part-time, where they say, oh, and that's the end of class. No more pay for 4 months during the school break. See you when I see you. So you kind of have to prepare for that stuff too. But yeah, everything in this book is pretty spot on. I don't know specifically about his experiences, the details of them beyond this story, but they jibe quite well with my own experiences, my own frustrations, and kind of the lackluster responses you get when you're trying to kind of sort your way through any problems that you're having with your company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It feels accurate to me too. So yeah. Well, I mean, there are full-time jobs, sort of full-time jobs for the dispatch companies, but even then, during like summer vacation, you get paid like 40% of your normal salary. Yeah. And so, yeah, it would be tough to survive on that, especially if you got a family here. Although some people somehow do that. I assume their wives are working. Their Japanese wives are working. But yeah, it's certainly not the 80s anymore.
Definitely. Also, I want to just kind of shout out in general Ian's comics. We reviewed his comics years ago. I think when we were following him on Tumblr.
Right. Yeah, I don't even remember what it was anymore, but yeah, we did talk about something else of his.
Yeah, I think there was he was talking about Japanese funerals, and I think that I just maybe a year before had been to my father-in-law's funeral. And so that's kind of where it started for me, that there was this kind of whatever he was going through and putting into the comic, I was also kind of, yeah, that's exactly it. So as a writer and as a comic book artist in general, his work is quite excellent. And I would recommend not just I'm an A.L.T, but any of his work. Go get that shit.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can find where we talked about that. Now there was an episode of Deconstructing Comics in 2015 when I interviewed him. That was episode 449. But
Yeah.
I'm not finding. Okay, here we go. There's a link in those show notes. Okay, it was Critiquing Comics 65. We talked about the issue 11 of his Square series. And yeah, I think that was where the funeral comic was.
Yeah. But yeah, I've always enjoyed. I think this is the longest book of his that I've read, and I think I've got one more that I haven't read yet, but I'd like to get to. I think it's called Alone in Kyoto. Have you read that?
I feel like I might have read that before. I kind of vaguely remember that.
Okay. It's also put out by Big Ugly Robot, so yeah, I would say get over to the site and pick you up some good stuff.
Yeah, biguglyrobot.com.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you would like us to critique your comic, send a PDF or a link to mail@deconstructingcomics.com, and we'll read at least 30 pages and talk about it here. So, till next time, this is Tim.
And Mulele.
Thanks for listening to Critiquing Comics. Mulele is on Twitter @MuleleRedux. I'm @DeconComics. See you in 2 weeks with more critiques.